The entire auditorium fell silent as the director's voice echoed through the microphone. Unfortunately, we cannot allow people who do not fit our standards to be part of this institution. The words, harsh as blades, cut the heart of a young mother who trembled before the audience. She had won one of the university's rare scholarships, but in that moment, the mere fact of being a single mother was used as a weapon to crush her dignity. Giggles erupted among the students, cruel whispers pierced the air, and some even pointed fingers in mockery. With teary eyes, she tried to lift her head, but shame made her feel smaller by the second. Cell phone cameras captured her expression of pain, transforming that intimate moment into a public spectacle. What should have been the beginning of a dream became a stage for humiliation, and each look of contempt seemed to push her further out of a place that never wanted to welcome her. But no one noticed that, sitting discreetly in the last row, a man was watching everything. He wore simple clothes. Nothing about him betrayed his billion-dollar fortune. He watched every gesture, every venomous word, and his expression changed as he grasped the weight of the injustice. There was something about that girl that seemed familiar, as if her pain echoed memories he himself had buried years ago. When she ran from the auditorium, choking on tears, few noticed that the man immediately stood up. In the days to come, fate would intertwine the two in a brutal and unexpected way. The secret she kept would be the key to a revelation capable of turning the logic of that humiliation upside down, and all who laughed would be forced to watch in silence the greatest turnaround of their lives. Like now and subscribe, because this story will touch you. It was a cold autumn morning in Boston, the kind of morning when dry leaves seem to whisper ancient stories as they blow across the red brick sidewalks. The university campus was teeming with life. Young people laughing among themselves, carrying expensive books and shiny laptops, their designer coats revealing a reality few there knew, the privilege of being born with a silver spoon in their mouth. Among them walked the girl with timid steps, her hair tied simply, her worn backpack slung over her shoulder like a silent witness to a life of struggle. Every step she took inside that place seemed to echo in her mind the question that tormented her. Do I really belong in this world? Her gaze tried to hide from the others, but she couldn't disguise the tightness in her chest as she noticed the eyes that roamed her up and down, assessing her as if she were an intruder in forbidden territory. Some chuckled quietly, others whispered, and there were those who didn't even bother to hide their contempt. But what no one knew was that behind that young woman's restrained expression were sleepless nights, hours of study squeezed out between bottles and the tears of a baby who depended solely on her to survive. While most of the students talked about trips to Europe and sports cars, she spoke to herself silently, repeating like a mantra that she was there by merit, by effort, by a dream no one could steal. The environment seemed tailor-made to crush the weakest, the different, those who didn't fit the mold, and yet she dared to walk among them, even when her heart clenched with the certainty that, at any moment, she might be reminded that she was not welcome. The tall buildings, the bright hallways, the pictures of millionaire donors hanging on the walls, everything seemed to conspire to make her feel even smaller, but there was a sparkle in her eyes that resisted the weight of contempt. It was the flame of someone who had learned from an early age to survive in the silence of rejection. There, in the heart of that university, two opposing worlds were poised to collide. On one side, the coldness of an elite accustomed to laughing at those in pain. On the other, the silent dignity of someone who needed to prove nothing to anyone, yet who would be forced to face the cruelest of trials. It was only the beginning of a story in which humiliation would become a stage for justice, and in which contempt would be returned in equal measure, but with the silent force of fate, which always exacts its due sooner or later. From a young age, she learned that the world wasn't easy. She was born in a forgotten suburban neighborhood, where the houses were made of cheap wood, and the walls let the winter cold through like invisible blades cutting through the skin. Her childhood wasn't marked by new toys or birthday parties, but by lines at community shelters, clothes arriving in bags donated by churches, and nights when her empty stomach rumbled louder than any lullaby. Her father had disappeared before she was even 4, and her mother, consumed by the burden of survival, worked double shifts that robbed her of the right to see her daughter grow up. There was no lap to cry on, no outstretched hand to soothe the invisible wounds, only loneliness and the constant feeling of being too small to bear so much. When adolescence arrived, the pain merely changed form. She became the target of cruel jokes at school for wearing the same worn-out sneakers every day, for carrying makeshift lunchboxes that smelled like reheated lunch, for never having a cell phone like the others. Every look of contempt was an invisible stone weighing on her shoulders. And yet, she kept going. At 17, life dealt her an even crueler blow. Pregnant and alone, she discovered that the boy who had promised to be by her side would not only abandon her, but also spread rumors that made her the target of even more humiliation. Friends drifted away, her family turned their backs, and her exhausted mother only repeated that she could not carry another burden. This was how she experienced the bitter taste of abandonment in its most absolute form, with a baby in her arms and no support network. She had to learn to be both a mother and an adult. Temporary jobs in cafes, sleepless nights, hidden tears in the bathroom while cradling her son, all were part of a daily life marked by invisible battles. But there was a strength within her that no one could destroy, a silent spark that told her this would not be the end. Books became her escape. The hours of study stolen in the silence of the early morning were the thread of hope that kept her going. It was this strength, born of pain, that brought her to the university campus. The world didn't know about the sleepless nights, the late buses, the fear of not having diapers for her son the next day. No one there knew the story of invisible scars that shaped every line of her posture. All they saw was a poor girl trying to occupy a space that, according to them, never belonged to her. But her past was more than pain. It was a silent testament to resistance, living proof that the despised can indeed lift their heads and walk toward the impossible. And it was precisely this past that would fuel the turnaround no one dared predict. It was a Friday night, and the university's main auditorium was packed with young people dressed as if it were a party, masquerading as a student debate. Lights reflected off the tall windows, laughter echoed through the hallways, and the atmosphere was more about spectacle than learning. In the center, a group of wealthy students was organizing a sort of secret contest, choosing someone deemed unworthy of being there and turning them into a target of public ridicule. It was all treated as a game, a veiled bet circulated through text messages and knowing glances. Among them, the leader of the group, the son of a well-known tycoon in the city, decided the poor girl would be the perfect target. He bet in front of everyone that he could expose her, not only because she was a single mother, but because she dared to believe she could occupy the same chair as them. The prize of the bet wasn't money. It was applause, prestige among their peers, the empty glory of humiliating someone in public and having it recorded for social media circulation. As the audience laughed at inside jokes, she entered the room carrying a stack of borrowed books. Unaware that she was already booked, the microphone was passed around and trivial questions turned into disguised attacks. "Do you really think you'll be able to study here and raise a child at the same time?" asked one of the girls in the luxurious coat, drawing laughter. Another, with a venomous smile, said, "Maybe you'd be better off trying night school, something more compatible with your reality." Cell phone cameras recorded every second, and deep down, everyone waited for the climax, the moment she would crack under the pressure. She, however, took a deep breath, trying to remain calm, trying to respond calmly. But the leader, with his cold, calculated gaze, couldn't contain himself. He stood. Tharp, in front of everyone, approached her and said loudly, echoing in every corner of the auditorium, "Did you know that our brilliant scholarship student is actually a single mother? A girl who couldn't even hold on to her boyfriend, but now thinks she'll hold on to a career here?" Laughter erupted like a storm. She felt the ground disappear beneath her feet, tears threatening to fall, her heart pounding as if it would burst. This wasn't just a cruel joke, it was the public verdict everyone was waiting for to confirm their bet, that she didn't belong here. And it was at that moment that the game, invisible to most, began. A game that involved not only humiliation, but also the fate of those who believed they had the power to decide who deserved respect and who didn't. What no one imagined was that the bet that sealed her shame would also be the seed of their downfall, and that every laugh recorded that night would return as an echo of inevitable karma. The encounter took place on a rainy afternoon when the university hallways were nearly empty. She walked quickly, clutching her books to her chest with one hand, her backpack sagging from her shoulder. In the other, she balanced the grocery bag filled with diapers and baby formula she needed to take home. The slippery floor made her stumble, and the books scattered across the floor like silent witnesses to her haste. It was at that moment that a firm hand reached out to help her pick up what had fallen. When she looked up, she saw the man who had until then gone unnoticed among so many strange faces. He didn't wear the invisible uniform of the elite. There were no logos on his clothes, no arrogance in his gestures. There was just a gaze that observed her calmly, almost as if trying to read something hidden behind her expression. Suspiciously, she muttered a quick, "Thank you," and tried to pull away, but he insisted on helping her carry some of the books to the door. The silence between them felt heavy, as if something was about to be revealed, but neither of them knew where to begin. He, intrigued, noticed the way she withdrew, the way she avoided prolonged eye contact, as if she had learned to shield herself from the world. She, in turn, noticed the strange serenity in this man, a stark contrast to the laughter and mockery that still echoed in her recent memory. On the short walk together, he broke the silence. "You shouldn't be ashamed of anything. Don't let anyone make you believe you don't deserve to be here." The words sounded unexpected, almost out of place, as if coming from someone who knew more than they were letting on. She paused for a moment, surprised, and stared at him with a mixture of wariness and distrust. No one ever spoke to her like that. Usually she only received veiled advice to give up or pitying looks that weighed even more heavily. But here, there was something different. She didn't answer, just clutched her books to her chest and walked on, leaving him. Standing in the hallway, watching her walk away. But that brief contact left its mark on both of them. For her, it was a glimmer of humanity amidst the chaos of rejection. For him, it was confirmation that this young woman was not just another student, but someone carrying an invisible force that inexplicably attracted him. Fate had finally drawn the line of their first meeting, and the silent game of humiliation, secrets, and justice was just beginning. The university's grand hall was packed. That night, the lights hanging from the ceiling reflected off the polished floor, while the most influential students spread out on tables covered in disposable cups and bottles hidden in expensive backpacks. The event, disguised as an academic celebration, was really intended to reinforce the power of those who considered themselves the owners of that space. The young mother entered hesitantly, invited only because the rules required the presence of scholarship holders. She wore a simple, hastily arranged dress bought at a second-hand store. Her eyes shone with the effort of appearing confident, but the whispers began before she even walked through the door. "Look who's here," a girl said with a forced laugh. "Did you bring the baby too? Maybe the nursery would be more appropriate." The laughter spread like wildfire. The group's leader, the same one who had made her life a secret bet, raised his glass like a trophy and caught everyone's attention. Silence fell immediately, as if everyone were awaiting the next piece of the cruel spectacle. He stood on a chair and said loudly, "I want to propose a toast to courage, the courage of those who insist on dreaming even when reality has proven otherwise. Let's toast our exemplary scholarship student, who balances books in one hand and baby bottles in the other." The room erupted in laughter. Some clapped, others raised their glasses in mockery. A cell phone camera captured every gesture, ready to turn that moment into a viral video, another public wound for her to bear. She tried to smile, but her face contorted in pain. Tears threatened to escape, and her eyes scanned the crowd, searching for a single look of compassion. But she found only contempt, as if she were an animal on display in a cage. Her simple dress, her worn backpack left in a corner, everything became fodder for ridicule. When she tried to leave, he grabbed her arm, not forcefully, but with the arrogance of someone wanting to prolong the spectacle. "Don't run away, you're the life of the party," he whispered with a cruel smile. And another wave of laughter rose up around her. At the back of the room, the discreet man who had watched everything until then remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the scene. Unlike the others, he didn't laugh, didn't film, didn't applaud. He simply watched, and in his eyes was a silent fury. For him, that scene wasn't a joke, but an open wound for all to see. The silence he maintained that night would soon be the prelude to a revelation no one dared imagine. The university hallways still echoed with the laughter from the previous night's party when she appeared, this time with a serene face, but her eyes carrying a firmness no one had noticed before. She wore no makeup to hide her fatigue, no expensive clothes to appear something she wasn't. She simply walked with silent steps, as if carrying a truth that needs no adornment. The group that had humiliated her gathered around a table in the courtyard, recounting and recounting the previous night's scene as if it were the most memorable joke of the semester. As she approached, silence slowly fell, as if something invisible weighed down the air. In a firm voice, without raising her voice, she said, "You think you surprised me? That I didn't know about the bet? I saw the messages, I heard the laughter before you even entered the room. I knew exactly what you were planning." The group leader let out a nervous laugh, trying to dispel the weight of those words, but her eyes didn't waver. "The difference," she continued, "is that you believe my worth can be measured by the clothes I wear, the money I have, or the history I carry. You never understood that I don't need your approval to exist." Her classmates looked at each other uncomfortably. The mood shifted, and the young woman's unexpected strength made the game of humiliation lose its flavor. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She didn't ask them to stop. She simply stared at them, one by one, with the firmness of someone who bears scars that other people's laughter can't erase. "If you think you've destroyed me, you're wrong. You've only reminded me how much stronger I am than everyone here combined." In the corner of the courtyard, the man who had watched her from the beginning followed her every word with an unreadable expression. This revelation wasn't just momentary courage, but a calculated act of dignity, a silent resistance that awakened something deep within him. He knew there was much more to this girl than others imagined, and that this scene was merely the harbinger of a secret that would soon change everything. She turned, leaving them frozen in their shame, and walked slowly out. There was no need for an audience, for justifications, or for immediate revenge. The revelation was enough. She had always known everything and had endured it in silence, not out of weakness, but out of wisdom. The seed of doubt was now planted in those who had ridiculed her, and that doubt would grow until it corroded the laughter that had once seemed so easy. That same week, the discreet man who always watched her decided to investigate who that young woman really was. Something in him had been relentless since the day of her humiliation, as if her story were invisibly intertwined with his. Using silent connections, he gained access to the scholarship students' files, but what he found was more than just an impeccable academic record. There were reports from social workers, records from community shelters, and mentions of an old family assistance case. And there, amidst papers yellowed with age, was the truth that made him freeze. Her last name. A name that echoed like a ghost from the past, directly linked to a mistake he himself had been trying to bury for years. The memory came back like a wave. Decades ago, when he was still an ambitious young man, willing to do anything to get ahead, his company had bought land in poor areas, evicting entire families, under the promise of compensation that never arrived. Among those families was her own. Her father had lost everything, disappearing in despair. Her mother alone fought poverty until exhaustion. The weight of injustice that had financed part of his fortune now had a face, a voice, courage, and stood before him in the flesh. The man closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the irony of fate. The girl the elite humiliated for being a single mother was, in fact, the invisible heir to a pain he himself had helped create. And not only that, in his distant past there were rumors that her father, in one of the many protests against the companies that crushed him, had mysteriously disappeared after confronting one of his former partners. A case never solved, forgotten by the newspapers, but which now came back to haunt him. He watched her the next day, sitting on the lawn, reading while her son played beside her with simple toys. The boy's laughter cut through the silence like an arrow. It was impossible not to see there the dignity that money could never buy. And in that moment, he understood that life was exacting an old debt from him. The girl wasn't just a student, not just a victim of humiliation. She was the living mirror of the injustice that made him a millionaire. The secret was before him, and the revelation weighed like lead on his conscience. The next day brought an unexpected silence. She didn't show up for classes, wasn't in the cafeteria, or even on the lawn, where she usually studied while her son played. Gradually, her classmates began to notice her absence, but no one cared enough to ask. To them, she was just another predictable dropout, the poor girl who dared to believe she could belong in this world and finally realized the obvious. But to him, her absence felt like a void impossible to ignore. The man who had discovered the weight of her past began to discreetly search for her, walking the halls, asking in hushed tones if anyone knew where she was. The answers were always vague, accompanied by shrugs or chuckles that carried a hint of contempt. In the days that followed, he realized that the university, which had once seemed vibrant and full of life, now had an uncomfortable echo. Every student's laughter sounded like mockery, every arrogant look a reminder of the wound she carried silently. He tried to focus on his own responsibilities, but her figure haunted him at every turn, her steady, unwavering eyes, her courage to face those who ridiculed her, the boy laughing with simple toys. It was as if her absence had opened a space within him, a space that no fortune, no success, no achievement could fill. At night, he walked alone through the city's wet streets, and the memory of that young mother weighed more heavily on him than any contract or million-dollar investment. For the first time in decades, he felt vulnerable, restless, incomplete. The awareness of the past, of what his wealth had cost, mingled with the inexplicable desire to find her, to hear her voice, to repair what seemed irreparable. But she had disappeared without a trace, as if she had decided to erase her presence from that cruel world that never welcomed her. And so, for the first time, the man who had always believed he had control over everything experienced the pain of absence. Not the absence of someone he possessed, but of someone who had never been his. Someone fate had placed before him to remind him that no matter how high one stands, the emptiness of injustice always finds a way to claim. The day his world began to crumble wasn't marked by explosions or immediate headlines, but by something more subtle, almost invisible. An investigative report began circulating on social media, bringing to light old contracts, forgotten lawsuits, and allegations buried in time. The journalist, driven by anonymous clues, connected the dots between the empires built and the families destroyed, revealing how the millionaire's fortune was born not only from entrepreneurial vision, but also from the exploitation of the weak. Soon the news spread like wildfire. His name, once associated with prestige and power, became synonymous with greed and injustice. In the university corridors, where he still circulated discreetly, the gaze changed. Those who had once revered him now whispered in hushed tones, and those who applauded his investments began to avoid him as if he carried an irremovable stain. Invitations to lectures were cancelled, contracts were terminated without explanation, and public opinion, relentless, judged him online with the same fury with which the students had mocked the young mother. The irony was cruel. While she disappeared silently, he was exposed in the public square. Social media was unforgiving. Old images of him at inaugurations were turned into memes. Videos of past protests resurfaced, and with each update, more people rose up against him. There was nowhere to hide. Every gesture, every word, every silence was interpreted as a confession. The man accustomed to controlling narratives was now their prisoner. At that same university, a group of students organized an impromptu assembly. Amidst posters and impassioned speeches, they spoke of the families driven from their homes, the destroyed neighborhoods, the forgotten workers. He, sitting in the back, listened silently, and there, in the same room where the young woman had been ridiculed, he felt the bitter taste of being the target of collective contempt. There was no laughter, but there was something even more painful, the silent judgment of hundreds of eyes that saw him as a symbol of what they wished to overthrow. The weight of karma was finally being revealed. The millionaire who had built his life on the silence of others was now silenced by the noise of resurfacing truths. And deep down, as his pride crumbled, he knew that this young woman, with her steady gaze and her sudden absence, was the invisible piece that had triggered his downfall. The weeks that followed were like a cruel mirror. The man who had once been greeted with applause at events and revered in luxurious salons now walked the streets without the protection of admiring gazes. He felt naked before public opinion, each step weighed down by the certainty that his image would never be the same again. But what truly consumed him wasn't the loss of contracts or the falling stock market. It was her absence. The young woman who had been the target of ridicule, the girl who had faced contempt with silent fortitude, had disappeared, leaving within him a void greater than any fortune could fill. For the first time, he experienced true loneliness. Not physical loneliness, but the kind that arises when all the applause ceases and only consciousness remains. He began revisiting the forgotten neighborhoods, the narrow streets where children still played amidst the trash, the unfinished buildings bearing the weight of unfulfilled promises. At every corner, he recognized the reflection of the past he had always avoided. He sat on rusty park benches, watching mothers who, like her, balanced heavy bags and small children in their arms. In these ordinary scenes, he discovered a humanity he had lost in his insatiable race for power. He was no longer the invincible millionaire. He was simply a man facing his flaws, searching for a meaning that money had never given him. At night, in the silence of his immense house, he walked through cold hallways decorated with works of art that no longer meant anything to him. The walls seemed to echo the emptiness of his life, and her face loomed in his mind as a constant reminder, a beacon exposing his shadows. He wondered how someone with so little could carry such strength, while he, master of everything, had become a slave to his own name. It was in this inner immersion that a silent transformation was born. It wasn't about public speeches or calculated gestures, but about an inner awakening. For the first time in decades, he wanted to make amends, not to clean up his image, but because he finally understood the pain he had caused. The man who once measured the world in numbers now learned to measure it in people. Every forgotten face, every silent story, every ignored tear returned as a lesson. And at the center of this change was her, the young woman who, without realizing it, had become the key to his redemption. He knew he needed to find her again, not to erase his guilt, but to prove to himself that he could still choose to be different. Their reunion was almost banal, but the repercussions were devastating. It was a cloudy late afternoon, and he was walking the narrow streets of a distant neighborhood, searching for something he couldn't even name. He passed simple little shops, old bakeries, and walls painted in colors faded by time when he heard a child's laughter echo from the square. The sound made him stop, as if it had pierced his soul. He followed the echo until he found the scene. She was sitting on a wooden bench, her son beside her playing with a plastic toy car. The simplicity of that image struck him more than any stock market crash or cruel newspaper headline. She saw him even before he approached. Her eyes hardened, not with hatred but with alertness, like someone recognizing a presence they no longer know they want to admit. He stopped a few steps away, unable to find words. For the first time in his life, the man accustomed to rehearsed speeches and million-dollar negotiations didn't know what to say. The silence between them was filled only by the sound of children playing and the wind blowing the leaves in the square. "You didn't have to follow me," she said finally, without looking directly at him. Her voice was calm but filled with a strength that made him feel small. He took a deep breath, his hands shaking slightly, and replied, "I didn't come to follow you. I came because I needed to see for myself that you're—" "Okay." She gave a short, humorless laugh and stared at the floor. "Okay. After everything they did to me in here? After what your fortune cost my family?" The blow was true. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if the words were daggers thrust into open wounds. He wanted to explain, wanted to justify, but realized there was no justification capable of erasing the past. "I know what happened to your father," he murmured, his voice breaking. She looked up immediately, surprised. Her look was a mixture of anger and pain, but also a need for answers. He continued, "I found out, and not a day goes by that I don't regret having been a part of it, even indirectly. I can't change what happened, but I can change who I am now." Her son ran into his mother's arms, embracing her with an innocent smile that contrasted with the weight of the conversation. The boy looked at him, unsure of who he was, only seeing a stranger lost in his own shadows. She clutched her son to her chest, and for a moment, silence reigned again. There were no tears from her, no desperate pleas from him, only the shock of their reunion, a shock that brought to light all the truths they had tried to hide. She was silent for long seconds, hugging her son nestled in her lap, as if the world itself might crumble, and that child were the only anchor holding her steady. The millionaire stood before her, motionless, with the weight of a lifetime on his shoulders. There was something almost childlike in his vulnerability, as if he had been stripped of the armor of power that had always protected him. The wind gently ruffled her hair, and the grey afternoon seemed to await the sentence that would come from her mouth. "You know what my family lost, don't you?" she asked without looking up. He nodded, feeling his throat burn. "It wasn't just possessions. It wasn't just a home. It was dignity. It was the ground beneath my mother's feet. It was my father's hope. You grew up on the rubble of what you called progress. And now you appear here before me seeking what? Forgiveness." The last word was sharp, and the silence that followed seemed to weigh a ton. He took a deep breath, trying to control his trembling voice. "I didn't come to apologize to ease my conscience. I came because I realized I can't go on without at least looking you in the eye and acknowledging the harm I've caused. I expect nothing from you. I just wanted you to know that I've changed, that I'm trying, even if it's too late." She lifted her face for the first time, her eyes brimming not with fragility but with strength. "You're wrong about one thing. It's not too late for you. But for me, maybe it is. I can't erase the pain. I can't rewrite the nights I cried alone. I can't give back the childhood my son won't have because I had to carry burdens that should never have been mine. I can understand your regret, but I can't carry it with me." Her words came not with rancor, but with a piercing serenity, as if it were a sentence delivered without hatred, only with truth. He lowered his eyes, silently accepting the decision. His heart screamed for a second chance, but poetic justice wasn't served in the spectacle of public forgiveness. It was served there, in the calm choice of a woman who refused to be another piece in his story. She stood, holding her son's hand. She looked at him one last time and said, "The greatest revenge I have against everything you represent is to keep living. And I will live. For myself, for him, and for everyone you tried to silence." Then she turned and walked slowly away under the heavy sky that promised rain. Each step seemed to seal a door he would never be able to open again. The rain began to fall as she walked away with her son by the hand, fine drops transforming the ground into a broken mirror of city lights. The millionaire remained motionless, soaked, watching the small figure disappear into the trees of the square. He didn't try to follow her. He simply let the distance become a sentence. On the empty bench where she had been sitting, one of the books fell from the bag and lay forgotten under the wet wood. He approached, bent down, and picked it up carefully, as if holding something sacred. It was a worn copy with pages marked with pen, filled with hastily scribbled notes between one life and the next. He opened it at random and found a note tucked into the middle, written in simple handwriting. "Life owes us nothing. We choose how to respond." His heart sank, and for a moment he felt the weight of that message as if it were meant for himself. The rain blurred the words, but he held the paper still, letting the ink run through his fingers. Around him, the square emptied, the streetlights flickered, and the wind carried the distant sound of children's laughter, still running through the storm. He closed the book, pressed it to his chest, and looked up at the grey sky, letting the water wash not only his face, but also everything that pride had once built. On the horizon, she disappeared silently, and the city seemed to swallow her figure with the same naturalness of someone who welcomes the inevitable. There was no music, no final words, no explanations, only the silent certainty that fate had already written what needed to be written. If this story has touched your heart so far, imagine what is yet to come. So before continuing, press the like, that's it, subscribe on the channel right now. This isn't just a click. It's your way of showing that stories of justice, resilience, and change deserve to be told. Join me on this journey, because every subscriber is a new voice standing up against silent injustice.